David Scobey. I am the Director of Bringing Theory to Practice, a national higher ed initiative focused on renewing undergraduate education.
Brilliant.
And I'm Christina Benitez, and I'm a MA candidate of the Learning Design and Technology program at Georgetown University.
Excellent, and welcome. I'm Bryan Alexander. I'm a futurist working with Georgetown on the Big Rethink and some other projects. So let me just start with our first question, which is a big picture question. And it is, what are you seeing in higher education as it responds to both the COVID pandemic and to the Black Lives Matter mobilization for racial equity? And what are you seeing in that landscape right now?
So I would say I am seeing different layers of response. With COVID, an immediate set of emergency response layers, beginning last spring with going remote, and then a second chapter of that emergency response, which is how do we reopen, how do we continue the work of education in this fall semester, unlike one that's ever been seen before, which had a new set of emergency response questions that hadn't yet been posed in the spring. And I actually think faculty and administrators have been fairly valiant about kind of digging in. We're in a moment in this short-term emergency response where there's now fissures and conflicts between faculty and staff on the one hand and administration about what to do. But from the distance where I see it, I'm struck by how energetic and even planful the emergency response has been that I've looked at. We can talk whether what seems to be the good ideas and the boneheaded ideas, but my gut reaction is kind of one of admiration for the crisis response mode. But kind of bubbling up through that, as I see it, and is a somewhat longer term beginnings of conversations that are a lot about pedagogy. What are the implications for pedagogy of the crisis? And that's not only remote teaching and online pedagogy, I would say, but also how should teaching and learning practices evolve and change in the face of the stress and challenges to well-being that the pandemic has exposed and amplified. They were already there, but it's intensified them. But there's the beginning of, I think, a very rich conversation about what does this mean for our vision of teaching and learning and getting out of content transfer models of teaching and an emerging discourse that I don't teach history, I teach students, might be one way of saying that. And that's, to my eye, a really important and good salutary conversation, but it's just beginning. There's also the beginning of a conversation about, that's a much more fraught one, about how academic institutions can thrive and survive in the long term, than in terms of resources, new institutional forms. But those two longer term, medium to long term conversations, I think, are only starting. In terms of response to the crisis of police violence and systemic racism, I actually think, and this is both based on my own personal reflection and kind of hearing the conversations around me, that the crisis of racism has people often use the word reckoning, and I think that's a good way of thinking about it. A confrontation with issues that have been avoided and swept under the rug and strategically forgotten about, or pushed into small to medium-sized kinds of responses around affirmative action hiring and things like that, things that are valuable, but insufficient for really grappling with the depths of racism in our history and in higher ed. So it doesn't feel to me so much like the emergence of a rethink as a kind of, to put it in Freudian terms, a return of the repressed in our that predominantly white institutions and white academics like me have not fully honestly grappled with, and it's been that excavation of avoidance and trying to figure out, coming to grips with, in the case of higher ed institutions, how deeply and subtly and kind of insidiously marginalization is designed into very ordinary, unexamined institutional practices, and what we can do about it. So even though these crises are deeply interrelated, communities of color are much more severely affected by the pandemic. Students who come from low-income and first-gen backgrounds are much less able to deal with making the most of the educational response. I actually feel like they're not exactly parallel in terms of what we are called on to do as educators. Both urgent, both essential, but somewhat different from each other.
I see what you mean. I really like the Freudian metaphor for this, and the sense of excavation. Thank you. That's a, well, we're all done. No, I mean that's a beautiful time. Let's
Christina, I come from a generation of academics who like thinking with Freud and quoting Freud, so you'll have to forgive me.
Oh yeah.
No, I appreciate that. I was just thinking that in your response, you touched upon a little bit of pretty much all my questions.
Well, keep asking him and let's talk about them together, obviously. That's just a start.
I guess I'll jump in there with one of my questions. In the grand awakening of racial equity, as we're seeing, there is an opportunity, some may say, for institutions to respond to the Black Lives Matters movement in really fundamental ways. What are you seeing across the landscape of higher education? How does this align or not with other trends you are seeing and how universities are responding to the pandemic?
So that's a really good question, really important question. So I'll begin by saying, even though I'm located now at Elon University, I don't have the everyday tasks of being a member of the faculty or administration who has to craft in detail these responses. I am struck by at least in this moment, the seriousness of institutional response, seriousness in the sense of people are understanding the dimensions of it, that it's about changes in curriculum, that it's about what it means to have a fully welcoming campus, one that doesn't center the experience of white students, of white faculty, and that names in a direct way racism and white supremacy, doesn't kind of soften our grappling with it. I think that seriousness has not yet translated into a kind of well-formed set of responses, and different institutions are doing it in different ways. It was telling to me that, Princeton made this, for their history, fairly radical decision to strip Woodrow Wilson in the name of the Wilson School and other places. And as often happens in what political scientists call a revolution of rising expectations, a coalition of faculty, staff, and students of color crafted an incredibly ambitious and challenging agenda of issues. And I think that's the moment where we're in, where energy is gathering itself. And I think that's necessary. I think to swing to the second question you asked about the relationship to the pandemic, as I have grappled with, in our little program, Bringing Theory to Practice, what are the implications of the crisis of racism? And Christina, if you're interested, we put out a bi-weekly letter called Bringing It. I don't know if you received that. It goes out to, so I wrote something 2 or 3 numbers ago in that letter called Taking Black Lives Matter Seriously. That really was the kind of result of sort of 2 or 3 weeks where I personally did not want to make an easy statement of solidarity. I wanted to kind of actually figure out what it would mean to respond authentically and to lay some first commitments on paper about it, and to say we are accountable to that. And for me, that felt like just the beginning. One of my takeaways was, here's a start. I want to hear from folks. There are things we will end up doing that we haven't seen yet. So that was, and one of the reasons why I wanted to think carefully about that and think about it as excavating, not simply reacting to the crisis, is implicit in what I heard in your question, which is, for me, Bryan's heard me talk about this in another conversation we have, the crisis of systemic racism, the crisis of economic inequality, the crisis of the pandemic, and it won't be the last pandemic, and the crisis of climate change are all part of an era of crisis. And I'm actually worried that we are not thinking the intersectionality of those crises. What does our response to systemic racism in higher ed, what are the implications of that for the way we think of educating students to combat climate change? What are the implications for an educational system, a higher ed system that's institutionalized inequality across sectoral lines? So I'm worried that we are only capable of thinking the crisis that is before our eyes at this moment. And it was the pandemic first, and now it's systemic racism more. And I want to try and figure out how we can act on the connections between those without either really or seeming to minimize any one of them. And it's one of the issues that I'm grappling most with without having a good answer to it.
Thank you. It's truly insightful and definitely speaks to the wicked problems we are facing.
Right. And thank you for invoking the phrase wicked problems, because I think one of the answers is, if we want to not simply be reactive to these crises, but bring to bear our mission, it's educating ourselves and students to be wicked problem solvers, and which means constantly grappling, as that concept says, with what the terms of the problem are.
What a fantastic question. Christina and David, thank you for that very, very thoughtful answer. Sorry for noise on my side. Some of our cats are pretending to be landmines, and people are finding them as they will.
I've been in conversation with you before, Bryan, so the cats don't stump me at all. They can do it.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. In your discussion, you've anticipated a couple of questions to come, and so I filed away notes on those, and that's how I'll rephrase the questions. But let me shift register a bit. What we've been talking about is relatively qualitative. We've been looking at trends and patterns, questions of strategy, history. But now I want to shift over towards a quantitative direction. As you look from your perch at bringing theory to practice upon higher education, what metrics do you track? What trends and metrics do you think we should track as we observe higher education responding to these dual stimuli?
I'm, as Bryan knows, Christina, I'm a cultural historian, an interdisciplinary humanist. And I often want to talk about trends without talking about metrics, or trying to describe them in ways in which we bring to bear often quantitative data, but we see those as benchmarks rather than goals. And even with that translation, I think it's a really good question that I'm not sure I know the answer to. If let's tease apart for a second the pandemic and its economic effects from the crisis of systemic racism. It seems to me that the pandemic, on the one hand, the pandemic has exposed and amplified long-term trends of crisis in higher ed. The unbundling of institutions, the turn towards an instrumental workforce training oriented model of higher education, deepening inequality across race and class lines in terms of access and success. Those trends were already problems we had to grapple with, and that people like Bryan and I were thinking hard about, and the pandemic has kind of accelerated and amplified them. I think unlike 3 years ago, it seems to me now that that we're not in a situation where it's going to be some kind of massive intervention or not that makes a difference, both at the level of public health and at the level of academic institutions. In other words, where I might have thought my job is to fight against what I call instrumental vocationalism. I don't mean education for work, but a very flat kind of instrumental vocationalism. That's a long-term worrying trend for me in higher ed. Now it seems to me the first order of business in terms of metrics of success is literally, will the federal government and state governments mobilize the resources needed to keep institutional systems and institutions, higher ed institutions, intact? Sort of on a par with, for instance, what happened during and after World War II to higher ed. During World War II, when the whole higher ed system was repurposed for training for the war effort, and then again afterwards with the GI Bill of Rights and other important changes. It seems to me that's the scale that is needed, and it's not so much where the trends line take us, but will that kind of massive intervention permit a kind of then praxis that does the important work that of renewing education that I want to do. And implicit in that answer for me, that my sort of resistance or my not knowing how to think about it in terms of metrics of success, implicit in that for me, and Bryan may disagree with this, is the feeling that although higher education needs radical transformation, it also needs intact institutionality. In other words, we need academic institutions to be different, but we need them to be institutions, because institutions gather energy in people and practices that don't have to be constantly reinvented. So in the world of envisioning the future that Bryan's been doing deeply for years, I'm personally someone who's allergic to the language of, say, unbundling and discontinuity. I really think we need community, we need continuity for teaching and learning to happen. And we're in a moment when the pandemic and the economic crisis could really undermine the intact landscape of institutions. And that seems to me, that's the go, no go future on that question. In terms of dealing with racism, which obviously is related to that, when I referenced that kind of Princeton statement that was this massive challenge to the institution, I read it, I was impressed with it. A ton of it I totally agreed with. Some of it I wasn't sure I agreed with. And so I don't feel like I'm yet, other than a kind of commitment to anti-racism and to probing and acting on it, I don't feel like I have in my own mind a clear enough answer about what would count as success that would go beyond just a very generic, true sense of more welcoming campuses, more diverse campuses where to be educated is to confront histories of racism and the imperative for anti-racism. But that's a very general field. So I think, in short, I spent 10 minutes punting on that question.
It was a great slow motion punt, but along the way, your legs swept through a lot of ideas, and it was a real pleasure to hear that. We've had a couple of previous interviewees reference the Princeton letter, so that may become a key document for us, I think, moving forward.
Yeah.
Well, let's step aside from metrics for a second, and let's expand our vision a bit, and let's think about long-term change as a result of 2020. And so, this is a two-part question. The first part is, what kind of longer-term changes do you expect for the broader higher education ecosystem? I mean, you mentioned earlier the question of how institutions can survive or even thrive in the long term, and how we're now asking these questions now. But what kind of changes do you expect?
Well, I think I'm going to spend a long time punting on this one too, but there might be some interesting stuff along the way. I think we don't know, it's hard to tell the answer to that yet for a couple of reasons. One, and having read your recent book, Bryan, I know you've been thinking about this. One reason is that we make a mistake, I think, in thinking of higher ed as one system. It's this heteroscape of different kinds of systems and different kinds of institutions. That's part of its strength. And not only along the lines of more wealthy and powerful and less wealthy and powerful. One could imagine a future, for instance, in which a democratic administration pours all kinds of money into state public baccalaureate institutions, the comprehensive universities, the Central Michigans and the Towson States, who educate like 2/3 of American baccalaureate holders, and that there might be that kind of GI Bill of Rights kind of renewal in a way that might or might not benefit community colleges and the 2-year project, or alternatively that the kind of turn to training and apprenticeship might become the mission of the 2-year sector, and our people like me, our total failure to make the transfer infrastructure work between 2-year and 4-year would just like destroyed that. So I don't think we know yet. I do think I'll put a stake in the ground for the idea that we should not overread the need for remote learning because of the pandemic. I think on the one hand, I believe that there will be a vaccine or some kind of systemic way of dealing with this pandemic. It might not be in 6 months, it might be in 2 or 3 years with all kinds of damage, but it will be there. And on the other hand, my own sense is that people are hungry for face-to-face communities of learning, even when they incorporate all kinds of digital and virtual tools as part of that. So I don't mean that in a kind of sort of Luddite anti-digital way, but I think if I'm right, then we'll go to a system which might be called online on tap rather than online on top, something like that. And we all, I mean, Bryan Alexander knows more about this than I am. There are all kinds of ways in which that's happening really creatively already. And I think it may happen more extremely as faculty in this moment of crisis learn how to create communities better using digital tools and learn how to, that may enable us to play, for instance, with something that would be near and dear to me, which is the dismantling of the semester credit hour ecology of the 15-week course and the 3-course credit hour, so that we had a more organic array of learning experiences that would be able to mix in the high flex way Bryan just was chatting about, community-based work and kind of moments of retreat in a classroom and digital work. That would be the really positive. And I think if I'm right about the vaccine or the medical responses, the more resourced institutions will do that. I think that kind of return to embodied learning, but broken free of the iron law of disciplines and credit hours, where, for instance, the curriculum could be organized around wicked problems, Christina, in the way that you were referencing.
That's actually a great transition to the next question. Here, by the way, just as a meta note, we're getting clobbered by a big thunder and lightning storm. So, Christina, if I suddenly go blank, can you keep the questions coming?
Of course, glad to, in honor.
We'll be fine.
This is one reason why I've got cats all over me. They're just, they're scared. You were thinking about the intersectionality of these issues, and these are great thoughts, David, about the heteroscape of different systems. That's a great way of putting this. Earlier, you said that we are entering an era of crises, crises, and that we need to rethink the intersectionality between, for example, economic inequality, systematic racism, and climate change. And this is where wicked problems come in, because they are by their nature not bound up to easy frameworks.
Right.
Can you say a bit more about that kind of intersectionality, that kind of connection between these giant trends?
So first of all, at the level of just the problems themselves, we think we all have this shared sense that these are deeply interconnected. And I would say the historian in me that likes to kind of figure out and synthesize big stories of sort of what's happening would say that it makes sense to me to use that word era because it's if we're sort of periodizing human history, we're in a moment in which the contradictions of globalization, but its interconnectedness and its corrosion of existing structures, national structures, state, local communities, at the same time as the emergence of new kinds of communities and solidarities, at the same time as there's a rebellion politically that began in the US with Reagan against a kind of weakening of public life and belief in the public sphere and government, which exacerbated the inequality crisis and turned what was a more invisible crisis of racism into an uglier, more overt one. All of these things are working together. Oh yeah, and one of the effects is the planet is on the planet and climate change at just the moment when we've lost some of the agencies, I mean that in the broadest sense, of dealing at that scale. I mean, I keep coming back to the end of World War II, which I think is fascinating, but the invention of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the World Bank with all of its contradictions, the idea of kind of a global mobilization of political will to solve problems, we're so far from that. So students are growing up in a world, and we live in a world where we can let these things just happen to us. Climate change will just happen to us, and we'll deal with the 100-degree heat that's outside of North Carolina, or, students from working class backgrounds and communities of color will just have to accept the life chance choices that they have. Or we can make the mission of higher education in large part, to educate students to be agents of change in this. And I think that what that means is absolutely a more inclusive and not just diverse, but truly inclusive set of learning communities and teaching communities that have responded to the systematic exclusion of people of color, of low-income people, of other communities as well, that remakes the community of learning, that points research and teaching towards those wicked problem solving. And I think that will mean both that the titles in the curriculum will look different, but also the design of learning experiences has to look different in the way that we were touching on in the previous answer. I really think the ecology of gen ed to majors, course-based, semester-based courses, credit hours, teaching labor assigned is like, I've got my 2 or 3 courses in my office hours. All of that, I am as radical a believer in transformation as you can be, even as I was talking about the need to sustain institutions. I think institutions need to be the site on which that change happens.
And let me say, it's not quite radical at all. I'm taking a course on the neurobiology of learning differences. And one of the things that I'm learning and delving into is how just on the meta scale, how we conceptualize learning and how it has been, the framework itself needs to be reimagined, in that it really follows a Cartesian view where, learning is seen as something that happens only on the frontal cortex.
Right.
And when science is increasingly proving that, it's you called it, I think you referred to earlier as it embodied learning. And we're talking about this notion about embodied cognition, and that our senses are ever more important in how we are able to process information and make these connections and synthesize. And perhaps that's one of the challenges that we're facing in this transition is, how do we account for that? Because as you eloquently and in your salient points earlier said, there's a hunger for more than just the information transfer, but also thinking about how can we meet the need of learners on a meta scale, in their learning process, to have more sensory experiences in engagement. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you back. 2 thoughts. One is, I think what you said is totally right. from the point of view of the conventional academy, it's still incredibly radical. The more important point, I think, that you are rightly connecting what I would call sort of the whole person or well-being agenda to the agenda of social agency and social change. And I think that's really true, that this is true of our work in bringing theory to practice. We're known as like a well-being shop and a civic engagement shop. And I think in this moment of crisis and transformation, teaching and learning has to attend to that holistic and embodied and affective need of the whole the person learning with all of her faculties. And at the same time, because that's often taken as a kind of psychological individualism and a turning inward, that's actually the same process as endowing students with agency and a sense of calling to make change in the world and to see themselves as change agents.
Thank you. I love the way you two have conversations, and I think if we're going to do a follow-up, it would just be you two with me taking notes, because I love the directions you're taking this in, Christina. I love, Dave, I love so much about your answer, but how you connect privatization, neoliberalism through inclusivity. This tells us a lot. But let me ask for a question that's related to your Freudian interpretation, which is to think about the past few months, because it's only been really a few months.
Right.
What do you see that this pair of crises or developments have revealed about higher education that maybe a few of us knew, maybe was quietly discussed, but now is out in the open?
So I think it's revealed our failures. It's sort of like the tide going out and seeing kind of the rocks on the ground. But it's also revealed something about our assets and strengths. I think it's amplified and accelerated the crises of disparity and inequality within higher ed, both among students and also across institutions. Just as the economic crisis has illuminated and made worse the divide between underpaid essential workers, the grocery stockers, and people like me who had a job that paid that could be done in my den, getting to know my backyard better for the last 3 months. The children of those two, little stereotypical people I was just describing, and their higher ed experience, the disparities have been amplified in all kinds of ways, in terms of economic access, in terms of access to good learning conditions, in terms of the well-being issues we were just talking about. So it's exposed and amplified and accelerated the trends of inequality. First of all, systemic racial inequality, but others as well. And again, I want to try and think all of those and act on those together. I think it's exposed what's the right way of saying this? If the promise of a certain kind of educational contract over this past 10 or 20 years was, go get your degree, that will get you the job that you need, it's exposed the fragility, if not the falseness of that, because there is not that guarantee. Even as different different college students, because of their own class and racial inequalities, get affected in different ways to different degrees about that. It's also exposed the danger of, and the inadequacy of understanding teaching in that kind of siloed, disembodied, fragmented and specialized way that Christine and I were just collectively critiquing together. Exposed it because that's not what students cared about when the crisis happened. They did care about being in the presence of each other and their students, but not in order to write the very best, history research paper, that to get the A. They wanted to succeed. They wanted not to flounder, but they also, I think, really kind of needed and to an enormous degree got attention and presence from teachers and from fellow students. So it sort of exposed the weakness of our vision of that kind of dominant instrumental vision of higher education, but the real reality of that we provide something else that's at the heart of college education. And it exposed, and this goes back to what I was saying about illuminating some strengths. It exposed that that faculty, what's our stereotypical picture of a member of the faculty? Inert and defensive about change and only caring about their own little specialization. And the spring exposed that both of those are not true. That faculty were incredibly nimble in this crisis management mode and understood that simply being present as best they could be for their students and letting their students be present to them because of their own stress and needs came through. And those, I think, are really key assets to build on.
That's terrific. I was just pointing to the stereotypical elbow patches.
Right.
That's what I wanted to, I want to get in this. But Steve, I'm conscious. Excuse me, David. I'm conscious of your time and Christina's time, and I want to make sure that we hit a couple of other key points here.
Sure, I'll make my answers crisper.
Well, I'm not going to touch a straight line like that. I want to narrow our focus a bit. Narrow the aperture and think about a couple of different parts of higher education. And one is to ask about instructional designers, as well as academic technologists and educational technologists. And we're asking in part because this is one career path for LDT students like Christina. We're wondering what can the instructional design profession contribute to higher ed in this crisis moment?
If you go back to what we were talking about maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago about like the positive version of, assuming that, that institutions have the resources that they need and that there's a vaccine.
Right.
The positive version of a kind of tech on tap rather than tech on top, and experimenting with project-based learning in different temporalities. Mm-hmm. I think instructional designers and tech people are absolutely key to that. I think that, and in my experience working with them, they're incredibly collaborative and creative with faculty. As a dean at the new school, I was the dean of an adult bachelor's program and several graduate programs that had both online and on-site options. So I had a certain exposure to it. I think that will work best when we develop, and this is institutionality, but with a difference, where we develop relationships between those shops and faculty that are really collaborative and organic, where instructional designers are working with faculty and with what I would call staff educators, people in advisors and teaching and learning centers and civic engagement centers. The best models of civic engagement work are ones where faculty and staff have this deep collaborative relationship. The danger, and this is not a danger from the professional ethos of instructional design, is that administrators see them as this separate cash cow shop for, building MOOCs and stuff like that. And I've seen that too. But I think we want folks like Christina and also you, Bryan, I think, to model what it would look like in an institution to have really embedded connections between, say, the Office of Academic Innovation and faculty, where neither is othering the other.
You do avoid that othering as well as that exploitation as cash cows. Well, this brings to mind a question that Christina had, and this is Christina. This is the one about transformative and equitable education. Do you want to put that to our guest?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you touched upon this very saliently a little bit earlier, but to just expand a little bit more, given this shift to virtual learning, do you believe that transformative and equitable education is possible when students do not have access to the transformative spaces for exploration and are learning from their own homes?
I think it's harder, really much harder, but not impossible. I think, having seen my colleagues at the New School do pretty fabulous work, both in building communities of learning on digital platforms, and having that learning be infused with kind of community engaged issues. It's possible, but this refers back to the question we just had. There are no economies of scale in that. Those digital platforms, when they're working at their most generative, are really good for overcoming time and distance barriers. They're really good for multimedia. They're not good for doing what administrators want them to do, which is cheap delivery of educational content. You can do that, but it won't be, to go back to your question, transformational and equitable. And the ideal, I mean, you've heard this already from me. I believe in place and in, as we said, embodied learning that uses those tools to build communities and communities of change making.
Oh, thank you. That's very insightful and definitely speaks to some of the imbalances within, sort of reward structures in higher education for staff on the ground serving students, as well as for faculty, and how, tenure review processes are considered, because it like you said, there's no economies of scale, and it requires a deep investment in each interaction, and that sometimes doesn't get quantified, and not having the sort of the qualitative weight in how reviews happen can sometimes be a setback for that type of work.
So let me add you've sparked three little thoughts. In one is that what you just said about inequity in faculty work is also true still, or lack of equitable system about instructional design and tech, that in the world I was describing with all of this genuine collaborativeness, institutions, I think, haven't yet figured out how to think about instructional designers as co-educators and what the shape of the career would be. That's thought one. Thought two is, even though I believe in what I just said, you also reminded me, you sparked the reminder that in some ways the digital platform is empowering for marginalized students. I'm thinking of students with disabilities, but also students of color who are, I think we have evidence that there's less implicit bias with certain kinds of digital encounters. And thought three is just totally random, but we haven't yet talked about it, which is that in this positive new rethought, big rethought academy, student voice is much more central, and not just empowering students to be active learners, which is true, but actually thinking of students and institutionalizing practices in which students are co-creators of their own education, both at the systemic institutional level, like what should the whole shape of the institution be like, but also in charting their own kind of self-authoring, as students. I'm really passionate about that.
This is a great point, and Christina, David has a new colleague at Elon, Peter Felton, who is very, very passionate about that as well, and he's a great guy, wicked sense of humor. David, I want to push on to one more question,
Sure.
Before I run out of time, and that is about research and science. One of the things that we've seen in 2020 is the surfacing of very different attitudes towards research and science, both skepticism or even distrust or paranoia, but also the embrace of it. And so we're curious, what is the skepticism? What does that tell us about how we in the academy craft messages of science and how we succeed or fail to persuade people that they're relevant?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think one way of thinking about it is the anti-science attitude is an artifact, is symptomatic of the kind of crack up of the social compact that I was giving a very highfalutin sketch of. It's like the end point of when polarization goes from political policy polarization and racial polarization to kind of epistemological polarization, like, I don't believe your reality. And I would say actually that we haven't talked about polarization, which I'm actually really, really worried about, more than some of my much beloved comrades who are fighting for social justice issues. Often the attitude is, we need to fight those justice fights, and if you'll pardon the expression, fuck the polarization problem. I actually feel like what you were just surfacing is a sign of something that's really corrosive and really dangerous to both democracy and higher education. And we have to change the state of play. And I would say that, I mean, at the level of politics, I've got my heroes, people like William Barber, who is both about social justice and anti-racism, and also about building what he calls a fusion politics across different lines. At the level of higher ed, I actually think we need to be critical of ourselves for not doing a good job of taking seriously the concerns of the whole society around scientific questions. For instance, as a confirmed pro-vaccination human being, I think the way to deal with anti-vaxxers is not simply to dismiss them as yahoos and ridicule them, but to kind of engage them and talk about, both ethically and scientifically, why vaccination is so important and so not an infringement of your liberty. To give one example, and more generally, I wrote a short piece in the Chronicle about this, to see ourselves in higher ed as not deeply ensconced in a blue world at odds with people whose anti-scientific and often racist views we disagree with, but on what I called a purple seam, where we have to engage and build generative relationships, even while we struggle with people whose political views and whose commitments we often really deeply disagree with. There are boundaries to that. I'm not, this is not an argument about let's go out and kind of dialogue with all those Trump voters, but I think we have, to our own detriment, not engaged people whose own community experience makes them skeptical and suspicious of the project of higher education.
One of the topics that has come up in this enormous year has been the question of the digital divide. And we're wondering, what do you think of the impact of the digital divide on higher education? How has that shaped our response to the pandemic? and to the Black Lives Matter mobilization. What's the role of higher education in addressing the digital divide?
That's a really great question. So I think what I have learned from this year about the digital divide is that it's important to think about it beyond the sheer question of who in the abstract has access to connectivity, or even access to, you know, a tablet or computer. I think what we've learned is, or at least what I've learned, it wouldn't surprise me if you had already thought through this a lot, is that the divide includes access to the social and spatial and temporal contexts in which people can make full use of the opportunities of the digital technologies and digital practices, so that you know, a crowded, noisy, poorly connected house with even with a drop dead great Mac computer has not solved the digital divide. And I would layer onto that that I suspect, although I'm not an expert in this, that inequalities in the infrastructure of different kinds of academic and other institutions are really an important part of that. Everything from being able to supply computers or Chromebooks to students who don't have them, to resources for training faculty. So there's a whole set of social infrastructures that amplify the technical infrastructure aspects of the digital divide. And then the last thing I would say, just thinking it aloud in real time, is that to the extent that there's disparity in the isolationism with which different people have to use digital technologies, that's an important part of the divide. And I mean that isolationism both in terms of face-to-face communities or social settings in which people can collectively support and kind of educate each other about digital practices, but also access to online communities. I think, you know, it's always been a really important part of my vision of what in our first conversation I was calling online on tap rather than online on top, that our model of using digital technologies needs to be embedded in learning communities and social communities. You know, the kind of the vision of the lone working mom at 11 p.m. in front of the computer in her kitchen getting her Phoenix University degree is exactly the wrong way we should think about it. And I suspect that the digital divide partly creates disparities between people who have a more isolationist access to digital learning and people who can learn in learning communities, whether that's, you know, in the local coffee house or in terms of online communities. And I think it's really important for academic institutions and teachers to do everything they can to create communities of learning as part of overcoming those disparities.
That's a fantastic answer. I love the social dimension of this beyond the immediate problem of network and hardware connectivity. I like how this connects to learning communities in general.
Right. And I think I kind of knew that, you know, that's an answer that comes out of my own experience as a teacher and my values, but hearing firsthand what worked and what was really hard about students' experiences and faculty and staff experiences, you know, Zoom in the crisis just reinforced that sense that we have to be an anthropologist of the digital design divide, not just a technologist of the digital divide.
Not a sociologist?
Bryan, you're hearing my prejudices about social science versus humanities. I got a graduate master's equivalent in anthropology and learn a lot from sociologists, but I confess I tend to other that field a little bit. Well, I won't defend that, but
well, that's fair. That's fair.
Where I am.
Yeah, that's a fair question, or a fair observation, and a fair bias. I really appreciate that. Well, that's a full and rich answer to our last question. The last one, I guess that I would like to give you a shot at is, what haven't we covered that you think is vital from your perspective? I mean, that is, we've touched on a range of topics, including the role of science and research, the role of instructional designers. What about higher education has been revealed by the crisis? Some of the longer term changes, especially in terms of racial inequality, some of the connections to privatization and neoliberalism dating back to Reagan, the flexibility of faculty, that professors are not inert, but they're actually capable of great change. The importance of student voice in institutional practices and so on. What else would you like to leave us with that we should be considering as we progress through this big rethink?
So I don't think of like chunks of content that we didn't take up. It was a very great, wide-ranging conversation, and I really appreciated some of the things that I hadn't thought about, like connecting the wars over science to these questions. I thought a lot about that after our conversation. I guess I would underscore two things that I kind of touched on, but put a stake in the ground for them, or maybe two or three. One is, I think, the importance of bringing, in our history, I talked yesterday about how it seemed to me that these crises have illuminated our failures, but also some of our assets and successes. And that sense that we have a complicated, contradictory history that's full of resources for ourselves, which is bringing theory to practice is kind of, elevator pitch, that we are both radical and foundational, that we're radical in both senses of the word, in the sense of being rooted and being transformative. And there's a way of thinking about this moment that I think is partly embedded in the phrase, the big rethink, that tells a story about we're in this incredibly existential nexus of crisis, and it's pushing the need and the possibility of totally rethinking what we do. That it's only an intimation, an undertone, but it's also part of the way a lot of people are thinking. Arundhati Roy, the Indian novelist, wrote this essay that has been very influential, where she describes the pandemic as a portal where we can leave behind all the crap of our past and enter into a new world. I actually think that's misguided. I think we do want to be transformative and leave a lot of crap behind, but I think we need to carry with us the assets, the commitment to liberal education, the commitment to democracy education, the traditions of internal innovation that are the flip side of everything we failed at and that we talked about yesterday. And it's part of why I made a plea in our first conversation for needing to work for the intactness of institutions, even while we transform those institutions. And that tension between carrying with us the generative parts of our history while we respond to the failures of that history that the pandemic and the racism crisis have illuminated is something that's really important. I think its intention, I don't want to caricature here, but there's a certain way of thinking about design thinking and reinvention in higher ed, in which I want to kind of assert that creative tension between old and new, and which is a kind of assessment of what our generative assets that we carry with us are, and what's the crap we need to leave behind. And I worry about that. I worry about the phrase "the big rethink" for that's not said as critique, but as trying to problematize or trouble some of the connotations of that language in ways that we talked, I think, pretty richly about, but I wanted to kind of underscore that. And then the other thing I would say is, and we did talk about this yesterday, is I think the need to, in this rethink, this reinvention, this repurposing of our traditions and assets, being utterly committed to both the project of the sort of well-being project of the whole person and the democracy project of transforming the society, and kind of in everything we do, keeping those purposes of education that are there in our traditions but contested and undermined, keeping them as kind of pole stars as we sort of navigate these various storms.
Mm. Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I appreciate each part of that. The necessity of summoning up history, the bad, the failures, as well as the triumphs and advances, the full range of possibility, and the critique of pandemic as portal, as well as big rethink. And above all, maintaining that North Star, the democratic purpose. That's a fantastic conclusion. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's always great to talk with you, and this is a really, really rich conversation. You gave me a lot to think about through the questions.